1972, if you had $400 or about $2,900 in January of 2024, you could purchase this Marantz 4430 quadraphonic receiver. Now in episode number 77, I reviewed the Marantz 4270 quadraphonic stereo receiver. The main difference is that the 4270 had a mode that allowed it to be bridged for just two-channel operation, so you could get basically twice as much power out of the unit if you just wanted to use it as a stereo receiver instead of a quadraphonic receiver. The 4430, this guy, doesn't have that option. It runs as a quad receiver. You can obviously use the faders to go more to the front or to the rear or to the right or left, but for the testing I set it up so that into 8 ohm loads all channels were putting out about the same amount of power, although I only tested the two front channels, the left and right channel for the front, just to get a feel for how much this thing could put out and work with all speakers operating, so to speak. So the 4430 was rated at 30 watts per channel into either 8 or 4 ohms at not more than 0.3% THD, and we'll go over the features and we'll take a peek inside it. And as far as I know, it is all original, other than the controls have been cleaned and lubed. So we'll have our standard test results, and then I'll tell you what I thought after using this. Here is a close-up view of the Marantz 4430, and starting on the left we have our front and rear 1/4 inch headphone jacks. If you had a quadraphonic headphone, you could use these jacks to get quadraphonic sound in the headphone. Here's our selector switch with AM, FM, phono, tape, auxiliary 1 and auxiliary 2 inputs. Here is our mode selector switch, and I did all my testing in the 2-channel, but it has a few other modes for using quadraphonic, or if you didn't have a quadraphonic source, it can synthesize that, and that's what this dimension switch here, it's when you have it in the very matrix position, you use this switch here to get some different effects. Now, this unit had a remote control. It had a wired remote control. We'll see that around back where that plugged in, and you could select whether you wanted to use the remote control or not. We do have our bass and treble controls here, and we do have our volume control right there, and of course our power button is there. Now we have our infamous gyro touch tuning, I guess it's called. Our main speaker switch is here, and our remote speaker switch is here. They say to use either 8 ohm or 16 ohm speakers, so you could have a total of 8 speakers connected to the 4470. You also have a high filter here and a loudness switch here, and then you have your balance controls for left and right, front and rear, and that is here. You have your FM muting switch here, an FM mono switch, and then you have a tape monitor switch here, and you can choose either the tape or the source. So that's kind of what the Marantz 4430 looks like from the front, and hopefully it shows well in the video, but you get that nice backlit Marantz look. It's just a really cool look. This obviously is the rear of the 4430, and we'll start over here on the right with our phonograph grounding lug right there. Speaking of phonograph, here's our input for the phono, and here is an input for the tape. We also have our 2 auxiliary inputs right here and here for 1 and 2, and then we have different tape inputs. They're broken down for front and rear, and then we have front and rear outputs for the tape. Now, something that's a little unusual is this attenuator for the antenna, which is right there, and it was out for my listening test. Our AM and FM antenna jacks are right here, and we do have a muting level adjust for the FM muting, and that's this guy right here, and this is obviously our AM rod antenna. We do have a jack here for the FM quadrail output. Back when they thought there was going to be FM quad going on, you could hook up an adapter to here to get the FM quad. We also have an unswitched AC outlet there, a switched AC outlet here. The remote control if you had a wired remote control, would plug in right here. Let me see if I can move that out of the way. Hopefully you can see that. It's kind of like a DIN jack, and that's where the remote control would plug into. We also have our user replaceable fuse right here, and then our remote speakers are connected over here, and the main speakers are connected over here, the front being here and the rear being here. And you could connect up to 8 ohm or 16 ohm speakers to these jacks here. Here is a view of the 4430 with the top cover removed, kind of just to give you a feel what's going on there. I should mention that this guy weighs in at about 39 pounds, and that's with the metal case. There was an option for a wooden case. These 4 big filter capacitors are 50 volt, 9,000 microfarads each, and you can kind of just see the technology that was used back in 1972. And we'll just kind of go around a little bit closer if I can, get some different views. And you can tell that all the capacitors are original as far as I can tell. This is how it came out of the factory in 1972. .430, putting out 5 watts into 8 ohm loads. Now I'm just showing the front left and right channels. I also have the rear left and right channels hooked up to 8 ohm loads, and I adjusted the balance so that the front and rear are putting out the same power. Now the SNRs look above, we'll call it above 72 dB, so that's not so bad. I did adjust the volume control so that I'm putting out a little bit above 29 dB of gain for both channels, and the THDs are looking pretty good. We'll call it better than 0.03%. Here is the THD SNR plot at 1 kilohertz with the 4430 putting out 5 watts into 4 ohm loads, and it doesn't look as good as it did when it was putting out 5 watts into 8 ohm loads. The SNRs are a bit worse and the THDs are a bit worse, but they're still not that bad. Right now we're looking at the frequency response from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz with the 4430 putting out 1 watt into 8 ohms for all 4 of the channels. Now we're only looking at the front, left, and right channels, and the reason why I'm measuring it at 1 watt into 8 ohms is that the specification was the frequency response should be plus or minus 1 dB over that band and that power level, and indeed we are at worst case maybe plus or minus half a dB over that range. I should point out that I did have to adjust the bass and treble controls a little bit. It's kind of tricky because they balance both the front and rear and the left and right at the same time, so you probably could do a little bit better than what I got, but I certainly can live with plus or minus half a dB for this old Marantz receiver. Here is the frequency response of the 4430 from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz with it putting out 1 watt into 4 ohm loads this time, and the specification was plus or minus 1 dB under these conditions, and you can see that we're down about we'll say 1.7 dB over here at the high end of the band. Now it looks worse at the high end of the band than it did with 8 ohm loads. However, at the low end of the band it does look better, so it's kind of a trade-off, I guess, and really it would be meeting its requirement at about someplace here, which I'm guessing is probably about 13 or 14 kilohertz. It's within plus or minus 1 dB. Here is a plot showing the 4430's output impedance from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. And there is a specification for a damping factor, which is supposed to be greater than 45. If we calculate the damping factor from the output impedance, we would get around 36. So it's not too far off the specified value. Here's a plot showing the right to left and left to right channel crosstalk. Now I should point out this is once again for the front, left, and right amplifiers, and I'm using the auxiliary 1 input, which is the input I've been using for all the measurements thus far. There is not a specification for crosstalk. At 1 kilohertz, it is between 50 dB to 80 dB, and at the high end of the band, the crosstalk drops to about 32 dB to maybe 45 dB. Right now, we're going to look at the isolation between the two auxiliary inputs. In this case, the signal, which is minus 12.3 dBV, is going into the auxiliary 1 input, and the auxiliary 2 inputs are terminated into shorts. And what we see at the very top at 0 dBr, we see the left and right channels. And what's going to happen now is I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the auxiliary 2 input. And so what you're going to see is a noisy signal. This is basically the leakage of the auxiliary 1 input signal onto the auxiliary 2 input signal. And you can see that we're under, maybe 52 dB is maybe the worst case right here. So we've got better than 52 dB of isolation between the two auxiliary inputs. Here we have our THD SNR plot at 1 kilohertz with the 4430 putting out its rated power of about 30 watts into 8 ohms. Now the specification for THD was less than 0.3%, and we are definitely better than 0.3% for both channels. SNRs are above 75 dB, and the volume control hadn't been moved, so we're still at 28 dB of gain or so. And our THD plus noise is around minus 73 dB. So overall, it's looking pretty good. I will point out that the rear channels left and right outputs are connected to 8 ohm loads as well, and the output looks just fine. And right now we're going to look at the harmonics, and we are seeing the second or even harmonic just a little bit higher than the third or odd harmonic, in case you were wondering. So overall, this thing is doing a pretty good job. I'm going to push the power a little bit and see how much we can get. So let me go ahead and start doing that. So we're at 36 watts, and our distortion is still looking good, and our SNRs are still looking good, and we're still looking good at 38 watts. The rear channels are looking good as well, and I am monitoring that with a scope. And we're at about 40 watts, and we're still okay. Probably can, right there we've started to go bad at about 43 watts. Our THD is above the 0.3%. So I would say safely this thing is probably able to do 40 watts for a while without having any problems. I mean, right now at 41 watts, we're seeing a little bit of the harmonics coming in here, but overall the THD is not bad and the SNR is not bad. So around 41 watts would be kind of the headroom on this amplifier. And the rear channel is looking fine too. Here is the multi-tone response of the 4430, and this is with it putting out about 5 watts into 8 ohms, and it's showing a distortion-free range of between 10 to 12 bits. Here is a plot showing the system noise level of the 4430. In this case, I'm using the auxiliary 2 input, which is terminated into shorts, and we're just looking at the noise, which is better than, we'll say, it's almost 70 dBV down. There is not really a specification for the noise level, but this is probably low enough that you might hear just a little bit coming out of the speakers when I do that test later on, but it's not very bad at all, especially considering it has all the original capacitors. This plot shows the IMD distortion of the 4300, and this is for the case where the tones are 19 kilohertz and 20 kilohertz, and the amplitude of each tone is adjusted so that the overall output is about 5 watts into 8 ohms for both the front, right, and left. Now the same signal is going to the rear, right, and left, so all 4 channels are actually being driven at the same time, and in this case I'm using the auxiliary 1 input, and the volume has been set to give about 28 dB. So if you add up the concerned tones, there's one at 1 kilohertz and then at 17 and 18 kilohertz, I believe. If you do all the math on those, you end up with IM distortions for each channel that's better than 0.0002%. So it's way down there. And the specification was 0.3% for the IMD. Here we have our THD SNR at 1 kilohertz with the 4430 putting out 30 watts into 4 ohms. Now compared to the 8 ohm load case, the SNRs are not quite as good, and the THDs are a little bit worse as well, but they're still looking pretty good all in all. And I'm going to go ahead and crank up the power, and we'll see if it's any different in how much power it'll deliver into 4 ohm loads. Last time it was about 41 watts. So we'll increase this till we start seeing the distortion get up to a level that's not very good. So we're at 42, 41 watts, and we're still meeting the THD requirement. Going a little bit more. So right now we're at 47 watts, we'll call it, and our THDs are still okay for the left channel. The right channel, it's sneaking up, so I probably could get one more little boost here. And we're at 0.1%, maybe 0.2% for the THDs. The SNRs are still above 70, and we're at about 48 watts. Let's go up one more notch here. And we're still doing okay as far as THD. So it's starting to get ugly here, and we're at about 52, 53 watts. Our THDs are, at least for the right channel, they're at 0.3%. So that's kind of about the limit, I'm going to say, for this guy. Our SNRs are still above 78, but the THD plus noise has gone down to about minus 50, minus 54. So I'm going to say that into 4 ohm load, you could easily put out, say, 53 watts. Here is our THD SNR plot at 1 kilohertz for the phono stage. And in this case, we have the input going into the phono input, and it's a 5 millivolt level signal. And I'm measuring the output at the tape monitor 1 output. Now, there is not really a specification for the THD for the phono stage. You can see that our SNRs are right around 39 dB. The THD looks really good, a maximum 0.001%. And you can see the phono stage gain is right around 37 dB. However, the THD plus noise at minus 39 dB is not real good. And that's mainly due to this 30 hertz hum bar from the power supply. Here is the frequency response plot from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz of the 4430's phono input to tape monitor 1 output. And it looks really pretty good. It's, say, plus or minus a dB. And that is, of course, with the RIAA filter weighting applied. So I would say the frequency response is meeting its requirement. The plus or minus 1 dB was for either the phono stage or just the regular preamplifier stage. As you saw from the test data, this Marantz 4430, which is about, 51 years old, did an outstanding job of meeting its requirements. I think it was a little shy on the damping factor, but almost everything that I have measured is a little shy on meeting that requirement. But for the most part, it did a great job, and just the build quality, the way it looks, I do understand why people like Marantz gear. And all the Marantz stuff I've tested, with the exception of one thing which had some issues, and I never did a video on it for that reason. I've just been impressed by Marantz gear. As far as the sound of this guy, I hooked it up to the Wilson Watt 3 Puppy 2 loudspeakers, and it sounded just fine. I did listen with the loudness control switched in most of the time. I did forget to measure both the loudness control frequency response and the High filter, I just kind of forgot. I got wrapped up in some other things, but as far as the loudness control, it sounded really good when it was on, and it just sounds clean. Now, there was a little bit of hum hiss when you were within about 2-3 feet of it. You could hear that, but it's not really that loud, and you wouldn't really hear it while you're listening to music, and that's kind of normal for most vintage gear that I've seen. You're going to get a little hum and hiss. With the Wilson Watt 3 Puppy 2, I imagine if I were hooked up to my Klipsch's Scholars, that hum and hiss would be a little bit louder, but for most speakers, it's not going to be a problem, because once you're a few feet away, you won't hear it, and when music's playing, you won't hear it. So there was nothing really that I found objectionable at all. There was no turn on or turn off thumps, just a relay, clicking on and off, that was it, but nothing coming out through the speakers. So it does a real good job. I'm hoping that this will be in my collection. I do have a Pioneer Quadraphonic Receiver, and I will be reviewing that at some point, but I would rather have the Marantz in there, because I don't own any Marantz gear, at least vintage Marantz gear. So hopefully I'll be able to work out a trade with Ian, who owns this, and it'll be part of my collection here in the future, probably by the time that you see this video. So once again, I thank you for watching this episode, and I look forward to reading your comments, of course. And if you like the video, give it a thumbs up. That's always a nice thing to do. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, that would help the channel grow as well. And once again, until next time, have a great day or night.